Well, good morning, everybody. It's Dr. Norman Cramp, the director of the Darwin Military Museum here in Darwin, Northern Territory, Australia. And it's my pleasure to present to you a reasonably brief overview of the bombing of Darwin, 1942 to 1943. I think you'll find some of the information in this presentation very, very interesting, and a lot of information that a lot of Americans wouldn't be aware of, and I can assure you a lot of Australians aren't aware of either. For people outside of Australia and for a lot of people in Australia, not many realise that Australia in landmass is about the same size as the United States of America. As you can see on the screen on the slide at the moment, the map of Australia in outline imposed over the United States of America. It is roughly size for size. It's Australia, like America, is a huge landmass, and as you can see, Darwin in the Northern Territory, which is at the very top of Australia, is over 3,000 kilometres away from the other major cities, and nearly 4,000 kilometres from Perth, nearly 3,500 kilometres from Singapore, and 3,255 from Guam. It's a long way from Darwin to anywhere, really. The travel is time-consuming, but Darwin is a beautiful place to live, as I'm sure Guam is as well. As you can see, Darwin is at the very top of Australia. The other major city in the Northern Territory is Alice Springs, which is roughly geographically in the middle of Australia. As you can see on that map, there's only one road that leads out of Darwin going south, and when we get to Katherine, that road separates. You can go to Western Australia, a bit further down, you can head off to Queensland to the east, or straight down through the middle of the Northern Territory to South Australia. So you can see by that map, the Northern Territory itself is a huge landmass, and most of Western Europe would fit comfortably within the boundaries of the Northern Territory. Let's go back in time to early 1941. And at that time, Darwin was a quiet, sleepy little backwater of the British Empire. It was a remote outpost of the Australian government, and not much was happening here. Main industries were the pastoral industries, some mining for gold, but all in all, it was a sleepy little backwater, and some people would say it's pretty much the same in 2023. The town and the harbour in early or in mid-1941 had virtually no defences, even though the talk of installing 9.2-inch guns at both east and west points had been discussed for 30 years. Nothing had been done. The 9.2-inch guns came out of a recommendation by the British General Kitchener, Lord Kitchener. Kitchener came to Darwin for one day in December 1910 at the request of the Australian government to advise the Australian government on how best to defend Darwin and its harbour. Kitchener never came out to East Point, where he recommended the two big guns be installed. As he sailed through into Darwin Harbour, he saw East Point and West Point, and he realised that any attack on Darwin was most likely to come from the sea. And so the big guns, the 9.2-inch diameter barrel guns, could fire a shell between 25 and 30 mile on a good day. So Kitchener, in his report to the Australian government and the British government, said the guns should be put there. It is important that they be put there. He referred to Darwin as being a sub-Singapore, meaning that Darwin had the strategic importance of Singapore, and also meaning that if the unthinkable ever happened, that Singapore fell to a foreign attacker, all of the Commonwealth forces and personnel in Singapore would retreat to Darwin. It was the closest port or city in Australia, and Kitchener thought that it was defensible. He also said that there had to be a railway line constructed between Darwin down through the centre of Australia to Alice Springs to connect to a railway line that was being built that then joined Northern Territory to South Australia through Port Augusta and to Adelaide. Not much happened, really, and certainly not with the railway line. It took over 100 years for the Australian government to build that railway line. The Kitchener's report was tabled at the Imperial Conference in London in May 1911. And at that conference, the Australian Prime Minister and the Minister for Defence said, yes, we're going to do it. We're going to put the big guns out at East Point and West Point. We need to defend the place. Well, as you know, in 1914, the First World War broke out. And what you may not know is that Australia's first action in the First World War in August of 1914 was to go to German-held New Guinea and to Rabaul and to attack and capture the German radio stations, the wireless stations in New Guinea and Rabaul, and to drive the German East Asia Naval Squadron out of the Pacific. We did that. We took the radio stations, we captured all of the German troops that were there, and the Southeast Asia Squadron was dispersed. They headed for home to Germany under the command of Admiral Graf von Spee, and not one of those ships made it back to Germany. They were all sunk along the way. One of the other things that a lot of people don't know about the First World War was that Japan was Britain and Australia's ally in the First World War. Even though Japan wasn't a combatant nation in the First World War, they did provide vital assistance to the British and the Australians by providing naval escorts for troop and supply convoys sailing from Australia across the Indian Ocean. And they also provided naval security to the east coast of Australia throughout the whole of the First World War. So by September, October 1914, there's no threat to Australia. The Germans have been driven out of the Asia-Pacific region. The Japanese are Australia's allies. We've got a war to fight in Europe, in the Middle East, and all of the focus was on that war, and all of the expenditure was focused on that war. As a matter of fact, in 1918, 80% of Australia's gross national product was going towards executing the First World War. So in 1918, when the First World War finished, Australia was broke, as most of the combatant nations were, although there were three nations that came out of the First World War with a rise in their strength and their position on the global political scene. Those three nations were alphabetically Japan, Russia, and the United States of America. Because Australia was in such a poor financial situation after the First World War, and because we saw that the government saw there was no threat to Australia's security after the First World War, because Japan was our ally. Germany had been, well, defeated. They never surrendered. Rather, they signed an armistice, which was, as you know, just a ceasefire. But nothing happened to installing the guns out at East and West Point. In 1921 and 22, the issue was raised again of defending Darwin. And the issue was raised again because the British, Dutch, Australian, and American governments were becoming concerned about Japan's military buildup, and particularly their naval buildup, and that they were becoming aggressive. And it's been stated that they were bullying their neighbours in the North Pacific. One of the other things that came out of the end of the First World War was that even though Japan wasn't a combatant nation, at the end of the war, she pretty well forced her way onto the League of Nations Reparations Committee. That committee was put together to look at the reparations that Germany had to make to those countries that were involved in the First World War: France, Belgium, Great Britain. One of the things that Japan did once she was on the committee was demanded that she be given all of the previously German mandated islands in the Pacific. And they included the Marianas, the Gilbert Islands, all the way down to, I think, Nauru and places like that. The Australian Prime Minister of the time, Billy Hughes, the little digger, they called him, he wouldn't have a bar of it. He jumped up and down and he argued and he picked fights with everybody, including the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, I think. And he said, Japan, you can give Japan whatever you like, as long as it is north of the equator. They are not coming south of the equator. They have an eye on New Guinea and Rabaul and the other islands. And I can assure you that Japan will menace us and will cause trouble for the United States of America within the next 20 years. And he said that in 1919. Very prophetic. So, quite surprisingly, our little Prime Minister from a little country, at least little in population and wealth, won the argument. And the Japanese were only given those German mandated islands to the north of the Pacific. But the Prime Minister's words were ringing all around the world. But by 1921 or 22, nothing had been done to start the construction of the defences in Darwin. So the Australian government called upon the British government to send somebody else out to Australia to have a look at how we should defend the place. The person that was selected to do that was Viscount Jellicoe. He was a former admiral in the Royal Navy. His biggest claim to fame that he was in command of the Royal Navy at the Battle of Jutland in the First World War. Jellicoe never came to Australia. He just dusted off Kitchener's report and he said, yes, what you need to do is install big guns at East Point and West Point, guns that can fire up to 30 mile, keep the bad guys away from Darwin Harbour. That's what you need to do. The Australian government, once again, accepted Jellicoe's report, but the thing that they overlooked was that by the mid-1920s, or even by the end of the First World War, the capital ships, the dreadnought battleships and, the big cruisers had ceased to be the primary strike weapons. What had replaced them was the aircraft. The aircraft was rapidly becoming the primary strike weapon even before the end of the First War. And at the end of the war, some nations realized the importance of aircraft and aircraft development and as a strategic weapon. And those countries included Germany, Japan, and the United States, and to a lesser degree, the British and Australian governments, to a hugely lesser degree, actually. So, in 1922, the Australian government says we will start building the gun emplacements out at East Point. By 1936 or 38, nothing had happened. 16 years had passed and no work had commenced on defending Darwin or its harbour, or indeed the whole of the north coast of Australia. We all know what happened on the 7th of December 1941. Well, that was the 7th of December on America's side of the international date line. It was, in effect, the 8th of December on our side of the date line. The Japanese, Imperial Japanese Navy attacked the US Navy base and fleet at Pearl Harbor. What a lot of people don't know is that on that same day, the Japanese invaded the Philippines, French Indochina, even though they'd been working with the French government for some time, Hong Kong, and they landed troops on the northeast coast of the Malayan Peninsula. And also on that day, on the 8th of December, at least 6 Japanese submarines sailed from Hainan Island in the south of China straight across to the mouth of Manila Bay. Their mission was to stop Allied ships from leaving Manila Bay and stop any ships trying to get in to reinforce the garrison, be they troop ships or supply ships. Within about 2 weeks, 4 of those submarines were ordered to sail, to leave Manila Bay and to sail to the north coast of Australia and to take up position off Darwin and to carry out missions of observation and laying sea mines from Coburg Peninsula to the east of Darwin to Point Charles to the west of Darwin, effectively blocking off the entrance to Darwin Harbour. So nothing has really happened about defending Darwin. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, all of a sudden work started on installing the 9.2-inch guns at East Point, but that work only started about around the 16th or the 18th of September, and the war had already started by then. By late 1941, Darwin's population had been reduced to approximately 10,000 people, with 8,000 of those people being military personnel. Most of the civilians had been forcibly, compulsorily evacuated from Darwin as the threat of war in the Pacific grew. And by late 1941, only about 2,000 civilians remained in Darwin, and they were only allowed to stay if they were engaged in what was referred to as essential industries, like the railway, the port facilities, communications, police, administration, things like that. Other than that, you had to leave, and all women and children were compulsory evacuated. Only the men were allowed to stay. So Darwin, as you saw on the map, is at the very top of Australia. It's very, very isolated, long distances to travel. But back in 1941, there was no rail link, even though Kitchener had strongly recommended that in 1911. 30 years later, there was still nothing in place. The main road, or the track, as it was called, was simply that, a dirt track that was often impassable during the monsoon, or as we call it, the wet season. It was a quagmire of mud, and trucks were often buried to the axles and almost impossible to move. So the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor. The submarines have left Manila Bay, headed for Darwin, and now we know why they did that. Because in mid-December, within about 10 days of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy Admiral Yamamoto issued his top secret order number 92. And in that order, he instructed his rear admirals and vice admirals to sail to the north coast of Australia and take position about 250 kilometres to the northwest of Darwin and attack Darwin on the 19th of February 1942. So these are just some photographs of Darwin, the way it looked in 1941 and 42. As you can see, sleepy little town, country town, not much happening, large Chinese section. All of the Japanese that had been in Darwin had been rounded up and sent south to internment camps where they remained for the duration of the war. But say again, it was a sleepy little town, totally unprepared for what was about to happen. As I say, on the 7th of December 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. The same day, they attacked Hong Kong, the Philippines, Hong Kong, French Indochina, Malayan Peninsula. When it was all said and done, in the Japanese fleet that had attacked Pearl Harbor, exactly the same fleet, the same commanders, the same aircraft carriers, the same pilots, and as we were to see, the same tactics, were standing about 250 kilometres northwest of Darwin. The battle for Australia was about to commence. On the 21st of January 1942, one of those Japanese submarines, the I-124, even though all the commanders had strict orders, observe, report, lay sea mines, do not attack. The commander of the I-124, for some inexplicable reason, attacked a US Navy convoy heading for Darwin Harbour. She fired numerous torpedoes at the ships in the convoy and fortunately missed with every one of them. The HMAS Deloraine, Her Majesty's Australian ship Deloraine, a corvette or a small destroyer, a sub-hunter, was on station near where the attack took. And the Deloraine's captain was ordered to go to the scene of the attack, locate the submarine or submarines, and sink her. The Deloraine did that. They picked up the I-124. They dropped numerous depth charges on it. And in the early hours of the 22nd of January 1942, the I-124 rose up out of the water, settled back in, rose up again, and settled back down onto the bottom of the Arafura Sea between Darwin and Bathurst Island, where she sits today with all 80 Japanese submariners on board. The boat, and I'm told by Navy personnel, you never refer to a submarine as a ship. Submarines are boats, which is why when we speak about German submarines, we refer to them as U-boats, because the German Navy referred to their submarines as undersea boats. So the I-124 sits on the bottom of Arafura Sea with all 80 crew members entombed, and they will remain there forever. The boat has never been opened, never been entered, and it never will be, because she is declared a war grave in about 1985 or 86 by the Australian and the Japanese governments. So she will never, nobody will ever be allowed to go on or into the boat. So the battle for Australia really started nearly a month before the first attacks on Darwin. But let's rewind a bit to the 8th of December, when the Japanese landed on the Malayan Peninsula. They moved very quickly down through the peninsula, with the target being Singapore. The Allied troops that were stationed in Malaysia, Australian, British and Indian, fought a brave but futile rearguard action against the Japanese, but were forced to cross the causeway onto Singapore Island. Next slide, please, Weston. After heavy fighting, the Japanese realized that they didn't want a street fight in Singapore. Military commanders don't particularly like street fights. They're probably one of the worst components of land warfare. And so with the Commonwealth forces now practically surrounded on Singapore, the Japanese army on the Malayan Peninsula, the Japanese Navy standing off the island, and the Japanese Navy Air Force repeatedly bombing the island, the Japanese came up with a plan, an effective way of having the British commander surrender Singapore. And it was really quite simple. They shut down the water supply to Darwin, to Singapore Island. All the water to Singapore at that stage came from the Malaysian Peninsula across the Straits of Johor. And so once the water supply was turned off, General Percival, the British commander, had no option but to surrender his command on the 15th of February 1942. On that day, over 150,000 Commonwealth troops surrendered. It was the largest defeat of British arms in history, and it will probably never, ever be repeated. On the 18th of February, and the Japanese are already in Singapore, and they've already moved on from Singapore, a troop convoy that was headed for to reinforce the garrison at Timor had left Darwin and was heading for Timor, but it was attacked by the Japanese fleet that was heading towards Darwin, or was already in position. The commander of the cruiser, the USS Houston, that was in control of protecting the convoy, was ordered to return to Darwin, as it was useless trying to continue to go to Timor, on the basis that probably the whole of the fleet would have been sunk. The Houston and most of the convoy returned to Darwin on the 17th and 18th of February, except the destroyer, the USS Peary. The Peary was a part of the convoy, but had been dispatched by the Houston's commander, the skipper, to track down some submarines that were known to be in the area. Now, the Peary, the story of the USS Peary is interesting in itself. The Peary managed to escape from Manila Bay on the 7th of December 1941 with orders to sail to Darwin. She did that, but unfortunately, on the way between Manila and Darwin, she was attacked at least 4 times by Royal Australian Air Force aircraft. The Peary was pretty badly shot up, and sadly, at least 6 of her crew members were killed by the so-called friendly fire. But the Peary made it to Darwin, and she sailed again with the Houston convoy for Timor. But on the way back, she was sent off to look for the Japanese submarines, and she never returned to Darwin Harbour until about 1 a.m. on the 19th of February 1942. In the meantime, the USS Houston and 2 other Australian warships had left Darwin, heading northwest looking for the Japanese fleet that had attacked them while they were escorting the convoy. The USS Peary, after arriving in Darwin Harbour, dropped anchor deep in the harbour and waited for the dawn to be refuelled and provisioned before sailing to meet the USS Houston and the Australian ships that had sailed just several hours, 12 hours or so before. It is absolutely certain the people in Darwin saw the Houston convoy returning to port, that they knew of the damage of the ships in the convoy and of the injuries to the men on board on the various ships, and they would have suspected, if not known, that the Japanese fleet was nearby and that they were probably in imminent danger. And as we know now, they were quite right, that they knew the Japanese were close and that there could be an attack at any time. And that attack wasn't long in coming. At approximately 6:30 a.m. or 06:30 hours in military talk, a Japanese float plane, a reconnaissance plane from one of the aircraft carriers, flew a reconnaissance mission over Darwin. And if the aircraft was noticed while it flew lazily around Darwin, all over Darwin, over the military air base, the harbour, everywhere else, if it was noticed, nobody took any notice. No reports were made. The pilot did his reconnaissance flight, and when he returned to the aircraft carriers, he reported that the weather over Darwin was clear, visibility was very good, if not perfect. There were about 50 ships in the harbour, and there appeared to be little, if any, air or ground defences. The commander of the Japanese battle fleet, Nagumo, gave the order to launch the attack on Darwin that day. On the 19th of February 1942, the Japanese attacked Darwin for the first time. As I mentioned before, the attacking force was the same force that attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941. The fighter and bomber pilots were all veterans, having been involved in the China-Manchuria invasion and the attack on Manila, and now getting ready to attack Darwin for the first time. At approximately 07:30 hours, the first of 188 aircraft made up of fighters, 81 Kate bombers and 71 Dyna bombers were launched from the flight decks of the aircraft carriers that were standing at that stage approximately 250 to 300 kilometers offshore. The formation, once they formed up after leaving the aircraft carriers, flew towards Darwin from the north, but they didn't fly directly to Darwin. They flew across the top of the Tiwi Islands until they saw a body of water that separates Bathurst Island from Melville Island, called Apsley Strait. They made a right-hand turn and they flew down along Apsley Strait, heading for the Australian mainland, but to the east of Darwin. There was a Catholic priest at the Bathurst Island mission by the name of Father John McGrath, and he saw the formation of the flight of aircraft, and he radioed into Darwin and he reported a large formation of aircraft heading to Darwin. Identity unknown, but I don't think they are friendly. The Japanese, the report was received in Darwin. It was passed on to all of the military commanders, Army, Navy, and Air Force, and promptly ignored. The Japanese crossed the Australian mainland coast to the east of Darwin at a point just near Point Stewart. They flew inland probably 50, 60 kilometres, where they did a U-turn, and they headed back over Darwin, headed back to Darwin from the south or the southeast. As you can see on the map, the line of their attack was to the east, then to the south, a U-turn, and then heading north, straight back over Darwin. The rationale for that being, one, total surprise. Nobody would expect the attack fleet to come from the north. And two, that the bombers could fly straight over the targets, prearranged, predetermined targets, drop their bombs and fly straight back to the aircraft carriers, thereby avoiding having to fly back over the target zone and hostile enemy territory, as was the case in Europe with the bombing raids over France and Germany. The first raid commenced at 9:58 a.m. on Tuesday, the 19th of February. The targets in the first raid were the harbour, the ships in the harbour, and the township itself. And as I said, even though the RAAF, the Royal Australian Air Force base at Darwin, had been warned of the approaching aircraft, the message had been ignored, and nobody was prepared for the attack that was about to unfold. There were 49 ships in Darwin Harbour that day, many at anchor without steam, and as such, they were sitting ducks. The first raid lasted less than 45 minutes, and of those 49 ships, 9 were sunk in the harbour and 2 were sunk outside the harbour. The only air defences in Darwin that day were 10 US Army Air Force P-40E Kitty Hawk fighters. We, the Allies, called the P-40s Kitty Hawks, while the Americans called them War Hawks. I don't know why the Allies or the Australians gave the fighter plane a different name, but nonetheless, in history, the P-40E remains a Kitty Hawk in Australian language and Australian history. Those 10 aircraft had been airborne less than 20 minutes before the first raid struck at just on 10 o'clock. They were also on a mission to Timor, but they had been told to return to Darwin because the weather was closing in over Timor, and it wouldn't have been possible for them to carry out the mission as planned. When they arrived back over Darwin, the officer in command of the flight, US Army Air Force Major Floyd Pearl, sent 5 of the aircraft into land, and he ordered the other 5 to stay airborne and to keep patrolling in a circular motion, just to defend, protect the aircraft going into land, and being sure that there was no surprise in store. Well, those 5 aircraft landed safely, and the pilots had, I think, left the aircraft when the Japanese aircraft came over and started the attack. Of those 5 aircraft on the ground, all of them were totally destroyed, and 3 of the aircraft that were airborne were also totally destroyed. And out of the 10 pilots, 6 of them were killed during the first raid. And I think another one at least lost his life as a result of the wounds that he suffered. The only warship that was sunk during the first raid was the USS Peary. As I said, it was a US Navy destroyer, a Clemson class destroyer. It's a reasonably old destroyer. Her hull had been put down, I think, in 1926. And she, as I mentioned before, had escaped from Manila and had made it to Darwin. One of the interesting things that I found out in my research about the USS Peary many years ago was that who built the Peary. As you know, my surname is Cramp. And when I was a young boy, when my father died, I was sent off to live with his brother, whose name was William John Cramp. And to my great surprise, in my research on the bombing of Darwin, I discovered that the USS Peary had been built by William J. Cramp and Sons of Pennsylvania, USA. So there you go. I don't know if I've got a family link with America, but I have pretty strong ties with America, and so it wouldn't surprise me if there's some blood in the family. Anyway, back to the bombing of Darwin. As Peary was the only warship in Darwin Harbour, and being a destroyer, a four-funnel destroyer, she would have been very obvious to the attacking pilots. In the first few minutes of the raid, 2 or 3 bombs hit the Peary in the stern, but by some miracle, the commander, Captain Birmingham, appeared to slip the anchor and turn the Peary's bow towards the open sea, and with all guns blazing and smoke coming from the stacks, the Peary started moving out of Darwin Harbour towards the open sea, where she could maneuver and fight off the attacking aircraft, as she had done in Manila and on the way down to Australia. The Peary was attacked a number of times before a bomb or bombs penetrated the forward deck and exploded in her forward magazine, sinking the ship in Darwin Harbour and taking 88 to 90 crew members with her. The USS Peary rests on the bottom of Darwin Harbour today, and like the I-124, is now a war grave, and as such, nobody is allowed to go anywhere near the Peary, definitely not to dive on her or to take anything off her, although some things were taken off the USS Peary in the late 50s. One of those items or objects being the Peary's 4-inch forward gun that was salvaged and is now part of the USS Peary Monument on the Esplanade here in Darwin. And at that monument, on the 19th of February every year, the Australian America Association and the city of Darwin hold a service to commemorate, to honour and to thank all of those members of the USS Peary, those who perished and those who managed to survive, for what they did in Darwin Harbour on the 19th of February 1942. And for 80 years, the story of Peary's end stood. And that was the Birmingham had the anchor chain slipped, turned the bow towards the open sea, and with all guns blazing, steamed out of Darwin Harbour to live and fight another day. But we know now that that story is not correct. We know now that when those first bombs hit the Peary in the stern, she started sinking by the stern. And we know now that the anchor chain probably wasn't slipped, it was probably severed, and that what turned the Peary's bow was the tide. The Peary was actually running with the tide out of Darwin Harbour, but there is no doubt that the guns were blazing, all the men on board the Peary were fighting the ship in a desperate attempt to escape the harbour and survive. That when she got about 2/3 of the way out of the harbour, as I say, she was attacked again and sunk. And so we know now that the Peary was leaving the harbour out of control with no power, and we are pretty sure that by the time she reached her final resting place, probably everybody on the deck was either dead or mortally wounded. All of the onboard communications would have been destroyed. The gunners wouldn't have been getting any orders. The men below decks would have been still keeping the engines running, but all of the other systems on the ship probably would have been knocked out. And so you're probably wondering how we know all of this now. Well, it's pretty simple. About 18 months ago, a couple of divers in Darwin Harbour literally physically bumped into one of the Peary's propellers. When those bombs hit the stern, they not only blew away the stern, they severed both the propeller shafts, and both of the propellers went straight down to the bottom of Darwin Harbour, settled in the mud, and they've been there for over 80 years. And now something of a debate is being held as to what will happen with those propellers, whether they will be left to remain on the bottom of Darwin Harbour or whether they will be salvaged. And if they are salvaged, who claims salvage rights and where will they be put and all that sort of thing. And so while we solve that part of the mystery of the USS Peary, there is another part of the mystery. We know that the Peary had a 4-inch gun on the stern, on the fantail, the same as the forward gun. While the forward gun was recovered and removed from the Peary, we don't know where the aft gun is. We don't know if it was totally destroyed when the bombs took the stern off the ship. We don't know if it was flung far away from the ship, and we don't know if the Japanese may have found the gun and took it as salvage, but we don't think so because the Japanese, we'll get to that story later, but it's highly unlikely that the gun has ever been recovered. So the first raid hits it about 10 o'clock, is over by 11:15. The people in Darwin came out from their shelters, looked around in total shock. There was confusion, disorder, some panic, and widespread fear of the danger of a Japanese invasion. And the fear is well understood, given that at that stage of the war, the Japanese had never been checked, they'd never been stopped, they'd never been beaten on land, sea, or in the air. So with people milling around, wondering what the hell had happened and what was going to happen next, right at noon that day, the second raid struck Darwin, with the target of the second raid being the Royal Australian Air Force, the RAAF base at Winnellie, which is about 15 kilometres from the central business district of Darwin. That raid was as successful as the first raid. By the time those bombers that were land-based bombers out of the islands to the northwest of Darwin, the Celebes, Ambon and islands like that, by the time that raid was over, up to 85% of the structures, the buildings in Darwin were either destroyed or badly damaged. As I said before, 9 of the ships in the harbour were sunk. The harbour was afire with the burning oil and fuel from the ships. The wharfing facility was almost totally destroyed. A freighter that was moored to the wharf, the motor vessel Neptuna, that was carrying ammunition, ordnance, took direct hits and blew up alongside the wharf, taking out at least half of the wharf, and other bombs did more damage. There's a photo of the USS Peary in her better days. Fine-looking ship and well built by that Cramp company in Pennsylvania, I have to say. In all, 236 Allied personnel and civilians were killed that day, and the number goes up to 260. The reason for that being, the reason the numbers are a bit rubbery, as we call it, a lot of the records were destroyed, particularly on the ships. Some of the ships were contracted ships, and the numbers of crews and that weren't known. Precise numbers weren't known. But anyway, whether it was 230 or 260, it was tragic. And 11 ships were sunk and 8 of the aircraft destroyed. But what a lot of Australians and Americans don't know is that of the 236 that lost their lives that day, 128 were from the United States of America. They were all military personnel, be they Army, Navy, or Army Air Force, and they fought the good fight. For all of that, for out of the 2 raids and for all of the damage, devastation, and loss of life, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost 4 aircraft and 2 air crew. It wasn't, as we would say in Australia, a good batting average for us. We were outgunned, outmanned, outmaneuvered, and the raid was perfectly planned, timed, and executed by veterans of previous attacks, and Darwin was just left in smoking ruins, shock, and terror. The situation was so bad on Darwin that day that a Royal Australian Air Force officer was quoted as saying, "We were so unprepared that 100 Japanese armed with frying pans alone could have captured and occupied Darwin and probably the whole of the north of Australia." And he was probably quite right. Out of those Japanese aircraft that were lost, the most famous of the downed Japanese airmen was a Zero fighter named Haji Toyoshima. It's really, the story of Toyoshima is interesting. It's a bit puzzling. Toyoshima wasn't one of the really more experienced fighter pilots. He'd only joined the fleet after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and it's thought that maybe the attack on Darwin was his first operational mission. His aircraft was hit by a single bullet while he was attacking Darwin. He managed to get the damaged Zero fighter away from Darwin, across the Arafura Sea to Melville Island, where he crash landed it and was then taken prisoner by an Aboriginal man, Matthias Nungalalawa. The interesting part, or the mystery, is why Toyoshima chose to do that. Because in the early part of the war, the code was no surrender. It was shameful and a dishonor for Japanese service personnel to be taken prisoner. It was a shame on them and their families and the emperor, and it very rarely happened. So why Toyoshima preferred to crash land the aircraft on the island rather than crashing it into the sea or even crashing it into a target. We don't know. He never said why he did that. But he landed the aircraft with some expertise. As a matter of fact, he landed it so well that the aircraft was inspected by RAAF and American personnel, as it was the first Zero fighter that had been captured largely intact. And the Allies wanted to have a good look at the aircraft to try and determine what made it so good. All of that aside, Toyoshima was the first Japanese combatant to be taken prisoner of war on Australian soil. After he was interrogated in Darwin, he was sent south to a prisoner of war camp at Cowra in Western New South Wales. He was incarcerated at the POW camp until August 1944, when the Japanese prisoners attempted a mass breakout from the prison camp. Toyoshima was one of the leaders of the breakout attempt, and he died during that attempt. But he wasn't killed by the Australian Guards at the prisoner of war camp. Rather, he was wounded and he took his own life, probably knowing that he was going to be taken prisoner again and refusing to allow that to be happen, for that to happen. So a few facts that people may not know. There were more bombs dropped on Darwin on the 19th of February 1942 than there were on Pearl Harbor. The raids on Darwin continued until November 1943. 22 months, I think it works out. The first of the 9.2-inch guns at East Point, as I mentioned before, work on the installations never started until the middle or late December 1941, and the first of the guns never fired its first test round until May 1944. The second of the 9.2-inch guns, the gun emplacement of which sits within the precincts of the Darwin Military Museum today, never fired its first test round until August 1945, when we know what happened in August 1945. The atomic bombs were dropped and Japan was forced to surrender, and the Second World War finally came to an end. So the big guns at East Point took no part in the defence of Darwin, and in any regard they would have been useless in the defence of Darwin, because they were shore-based guns designed to repel a seaborne invasion. They were not anti-aircraft guns. They couldn't have defended Darwin or themselves against airborne attack. And in fact, there was only one attack on East Point during the whole of the 77 raids that the Japanese launched on Darwin. And we think that attack was either a nuisance raid or simply a pilot jettisoning a bomb because his aircraft had been damaged, and they were just jettisoning any of the bombs that remained in an effort to get away from Darwin and for the defences that had been put in place following the 19th of February. And that single attack, I think, happened in early 1943. So effectively, the defences at East Point were useless, and the gun emplacement that was planned and agreed to at West Point never took place at all. There was no big gun emplacement installed at West Point throughout the war or ever. So these are some of the photos of the attack on Darwin and the damage that resulted from the attack. You can see the bomb damage. As I say, by the end of the second raid, up to 85% of the dwellings in Darwin were either destroyed or badly damaged. So this slide, this map, shows the bomb patterns that fell over Darwin, or fell on Darwin, from February 1942 to November 1943. And as you can see, the main cluster of bombs are down in the right-hand bottom corner, which is Darwin Harbour and the wharfing facilities, the oil storage tanks, and then back up along the peninsula that is was then and still is the central business district of Darwin. In the very top, just slightly to the right of centre, is the Royal Australian Air Force Base, and you can see the bomb patterns there, mostly on the airstrips themselves, and then other random bombs. But if you look at East Point, that is the point furthest out on the left of the map. There is well, the second furthest out. Sorry, at Miley Point, there is no bomb clusters there at all. So these are just some more images. These are Royal Australian Air Force bombers operating out of Darwin after the raids had started. These are the construction slides of the construction of the gun emplacements here that weren't finished until 1944 and 45, but they're still here today. Still look menacing, but really they never fired a shot in anger. While we're going through those slides, one of the things what happened after the war finished here is that in 1945, when the war came to an end, the Australian government pretty well abandoned Darwin and all of the defensive positions up here. The 9.2-inch guns, as you can see, were in position. There was a skeleton crew, a small garrison, stayed here to look after those guns, to maintain them. But in effect, the Commonwealth government, as was the case after the First World War, was broke. We had a lot of troops overseas that we needed to get back to Australia. The focus, again, was building the economy and getting people back to their normal lives. The situation in Darwin, the bomb damage, remained as it was for nearly 15 years. The ships damaged in the harbour were still sitting on the bottom. The wharf damage had been partly repaired, but not much. Hardly any of the building stock had been repaired or replaced, and the place was a mess. The people that had been compulsorily evacuated from Darwin and returned to Darwin after the war had nowhere to live. And so they came out to East Point because there were about 200 buildings out here on the peninsula. And they broke into the buildings and they set up house. And as we say in Australia, they squatted. The people stayed there, and the resentment started to rise until about 1958, when the people started lobbying the Commonwealth government to do something about cleaning up the war debris in Darwin and to rebuild the housing stock so people could get on with their lives and move on from the war. The Commonwealth government finally took notice, and they said, we're going to go to public tender to clean up the mess. And they did that, and they issued a salvage contract The only problem being they issued the contract to a Japanese salvage company, the Fujita Salvage Company out of Tokyo and Yokohama. The Mr. Fujita came down to Darwin. He brought down a ship and a floating crane, and he set up in Darwin Harbour, and he started his salvage operation and recovering everything that he possibly could from Darwin Harbour and Darwin Town and around Darwin, as far out as the airfield and slightly to the south of there. The only other person that had salvaged anything was that Carl Atkinson, a local salvage diver who operated a workshop in Doctor's Gully, just near the entrance to Darwin Harbour here. And he recovered some objects off the USS Peary, the forward gun and the wheel and the pinnacle and things like that. By the time Mr. Fujita and his salvage workers had finished, they had removed just about everything that they possibly could, including the two 9.2-inch guns and all the loading and firing mechanisms and power generation equipment from both the gun emplacements here at East Point. They took all of the salvaged items, the scrap metal we call it now, back to Japan. And one of the things that most people don't know is that Mr. Fujita had converted to Christianity after the war. And when he got all of the salvage back to Japan, he had the propeller, the bronze propeller from the US Army transport ship, the Meigs. He had the propeller melted down and cast into bronze crucifix, which he then sent to the Uniting Church here in Darwin in Smith Street. And he asked that those crucifix be placed on the ends of the pews in the church as his way of saying that he was sorry for what had happened, for the war, and that his way of saying, asking for forgiveness and moving on. The church did that, and those crucifix are still on the pews in the Uniting Church today, having survived Tropical Cyclone Tracy in December 1974, which again almost totally destroyed Darwin. So these are just a few more slides of Darwin in during the war and a bit after the war. It's some of the buildings that remain and a model of what East Point would have looked like in the early part of the war. So as I start to wrap up this presentation, in 1968, members of the Royal Australian Artillery Association that had only been formed in 1967, they approached the Commonwealth Government and asked for a lease of land over a part of East Point that included the gun emplacement number 2 and the original wartime command post. The Commonwealth Government agreed to that and issued a lease over the land. And in August 1969, the Royal Australian Artillery Association, or RAAA as we call it, opened the East Point Military Museum, today's Darwin Military Museum. It was the first museum of any type to open in the Northern Territory and has been operating since 1969, except for a period after Cyclone Tracy in 1975 and a short period during the COVID-19 pandemic just a couple of years ago. The RAANT is a charitable, not-for-profit organisation that receives no financial assistance from any government at any level, and we have no corporate sponsorship. The only revenue that the museum and the association receive is derived from ticket sales, it's admissions to the museum, and any surplus funds at the end of the year after operating, maintaining, and developing the museum is invested back into the museum by way of the purchase of artifacts and things like that. The Darwin Military Museum was established on the back of volunteers 54 years ago and relies heavily on volunteers today. And so these are just some of the items on display in the Defence of Darwin experience. A lot of the displays are fixed and permanent, and a lot we keep rotating or moving around. Well, from a wartime fortress, over the years, East Point has turned into a nature reserve. We, as you can see on the slides, it's a beautiful setting. It's very peaceful. We have quite a wealth of Australian flora and fauna out at East Point. And that ranges from wallabies that you can see here grazing out in the open, just right here at the museum. We have, and the wallabies come right into the museum. That's how one of our resident python snakes having a cooling swim in the pond. It's part of the Japanese peace garden here. The bird sitting on the railing is a peahen. She's a female Australian lyrebird. The peacock is the bird, the lyrebird, when he puts his tail out, it is huge with all of the brilliant colours. Our peahen, nicknamed Izzy, is a resident here. She's a favourite with our visitors. She wanders amongst them quite freely. She's very friendly. She's not scared of humans. And if you're not careful, she will come and help herself to your sandwich or piece of cake while you're sitting in the outdoor cafe area. So to wind this up, I once again thank you, folk, for inviting me to present the conference. If we can, yep. On behalf of the Royal Australian Artillery Association, NT, and the Darwin Military Museum, I would like to thank Pacific Historic Parks Management for inviting me to present today. I'd also thank the Management Committee of the RAAA that owns and operates the Darwin Military Museum, Darwin staff and volunteers, the Australian Government, the NT Government, and the City of Darwin Council for their support. Without their input and support of all of those people, the museum would not have been established and would not have grown into the status that it maintains today, which is the second highest visited attraction in Darwin, which is pretty good. I would also like to acknowledge various images and videos used in this presentation were taken by and presented with the permission of ABC Darwin, the Northern Territory Library, Matt McLaughlin Living History Television, and the Australian War Memorial. On that note, I will finish this part of the presentation and the talk, and I'm quite happy to take any questions. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.